and welcome to the fifth video in the series of videos that I'm making covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I'd recommend going to the YouTube channel #HisTV and having a look there. This is the first video in the second section of this GCSE History Unit that covers the Great Depression and the 1930s. I'd really recommend starting on the 1920s and those four videos if you haven't seen those already. Today, we're going to have a look at the key question: what was the experience of the American people during the Great Depression? We're going to think about what the Great Depression was and how the economic prosperity of the 1920s came crashing down, starting with the Wall Street crash in 1929. We're going to think about the experience of lots of different groups of American people, and then we're going to start to look at a change in politics and a change in leader and how that might then have spelt a better future for the American people. Now, there are 5 key areas I'm going to cover in this video today. We're going to start by looking at the impact of the Wall Street crash. This was the trigger point for the end of the economic prosperity in the 1920s and the start of the Great Depression. We're also going to have a look at rising unemployment that came as a result of the Wall Street crash. We're going to have a look at the farming crisis and how lots of American farmers suffered terribly during this time and moved towards the cities. We're going to have a look at the impact of the Great Depression on businesses, leading to widespread business bankruptcy. And then finally, we're going to have a look at the responses of President Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1929, and then what happened in the 1932 election, and look forward to the rest of this unit as well. So let's begin by looking at the impact of the Wall Street crash. As hopefully you know from my previous videos, in the 1920s, many Americans had borrowed money from the banks to invest in the stock market. The idea behind that was that you could buy a small share in a business. As the value of that business went up, your investment would grow, and then you could sell your stock or your share and you'd make money. In 1929, something called the Wall Street crash led to the collapse of the American economy. Almost overnight, the values of businesses dropped incredibly quickly, and that led to people selling their shares. The value of shares went down and down and down until the point that we have something called an economic crisis or an economic collapse. Those rich investors who'd invested all of their money in these businesses lost millions of dollars as the value of their stocks fell overnight. And many other Americans who'd borrowed money to buy these shares were unable to pay back their loans, leading to banks closing. And Americans who'd therefore saved everything in the banks lost that money. This is the beginning then of something called the Great Depression, but it's really important to remember that this didn't just affect America. This was a global recession, a global economic crisis. Those of you studying units on Nazi Germany will hopefully know that this was one of the contributing factors to Hitler's rise to power. And so clearly in America, the prosperity that characterized the 1920s had been destroyed. As a result of the Wall Street crash and the huge impact it had on businesses, rising unemployment affected lots of the working people in America. So many business owners cut production and laid off their workers. That basically means just kind of took their jobs away from them, told them that they didn't have a job anymore. And so between 1928 and 1933, production fell by 40%. Remember, during the 1920s, it was an era of mass production. And in order to try and save themselves, these business owners were stopping that mass production. But of course, if you do that, you're not making as many products, you're not making as much profit, so you need to lay off your workers. Workers that did still have a job found that their wages dropped by around 60% on average. So if you were still working, you're doing the same job, but losing money. And so by 1933, there were 14 million unemployed people in America, huge rates of unemployment. And these unemployed people really struggled. At night, towns and cities were full of homeless and unemployed people. Many people relied on the kindness of charities and on soup kitchens for food. And slum houses were built by homeless people on the outskirts of cities. These slums were nicknamed Hoovervilles after President Hoover. There was a sense that the Republican policies and President Hoover's unwillingness to get involved and help the people were to blame for this Great Recession. Rubbish tips were crowded with families looking for food. If you were unemployed or homeless at the time, it's a very difficult period for an American person. There was also a farming crisis in the 1930s. Now, hopefully you remember from earlier videos that in the 1920s, farmers also struggled. Many farmers overproduced, they produced more products than they could sell, and that really came to bite them in the 1930s. People in agricultural and rural areas were hardest hit by the Depression. The value of farm produce fell dramatically. Many farmers who'd loaned money from the banks to afford their land and afford their houses could not pay their mortgages, and so most farmers had to leave their land and live on the road, finding work wherever they could. Now, as I said earlier, in the 1920s, many farmers took advantage of consumer culture by growing as much produce as they could. But this overproduction and over-farming took all the nutrients out of the soil, and it turned millions of acres of land into a dust bowl. That is essentially soil where you cannot grow anything. Now, many farmers faced with a crisis, not being able to afford their mortgages, and with land that would not grow anything, they migrated into the cities to find work. But as we know, these cities were already full of unemployed people living in poverty, and so this exacerbated the problem. It made the problem worse. So we've looked at the Wall Street crash as the trigger point. We've talked about the rising unemployment that took hold in America in the 1930s and the farming crisis making that problem even worse. We're also now going to focus on business and bankruptcy. Now, in the 1920s, many businessmen loaned money from the bank, but they could not afford to repay them. And because of mass production, these industries were producing more goods than people could sell. Eventually, enough people buy your fridge or they buy your car that they don't need to buy any more. And so, as the demand for products decreased, many businesses then became bankrupt. As people couldn't afford to pay back their money to the banks, 10,000 banks were forced to close between 1929 and 1933, and over 100,000 businesses in America went bankrupt. Some businesses tried to keep going. As we mentioned earlier, they reduced the number of products that they were making, but tried to carry on going. And so in America, industrial production, or the production of products, fell by 40%. And the value of US exports, or products that they sent around the world, fell from $10 billion to $3 billion during this time. The American economy is shrinking, American business is shutting down. So clearly there was a massive, massive problem in America by the beginning of the 1930s. We now need to look at the politics of the time and think about the Republican politicians who've been in power for almost all of the 1920s and how the blame that they received maybe led to some changes politically in 1932. So how did Hoover respond to this crisis? Well, Herbert Hoover, the president elected in 1929, tried to restart the economy in the 1930s by introducing tax cuts, giving more money to the American people. He also tried to persuade business owners not to cut workers' wages, and he set up something called the Reconstruction Finance Company that tried to support banks and keep them open. But it's really important to remember that one of the fundamental values of Hoover and the Republican parties was laissez-faire policy, the idea that you do not interfere in the lives of the people, you leave it alone. And so Hoover was criticized for refusing to help the people that were suffering. He believed it was not the government's job. Now, to make matters worse, in June 1932, thousands of war veterans, soldiers that had fought for America in World War I, marched to Washington to ask for their war bonus or their pension to be paid early. This group is called the Bonus Marchers. Now, Hoover refused to meet these marchers, and he sent a man called General MacArthur out to meet them. MacArthur was incredibly disrespectful to the marchers, and he sent out police and troops who used tear gas and burned down their camps. This looked really bad, mistreating war veterans. Remember, America is generally quite a patriotic country, really value and respect people that have fought for them in the wars. This made Hoover and the Republicans look incredibly bad. Now, 1932 was an election year. Hoover was going for re-election, but someone else came to the fore at this point. And in the run-up to the 32 election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, promised America what he called a New Deal if they voted for him and his party. Now, Roosevelt had polio. He was very unwell. He spent a lot of his time in a wheelchair, and yet he made a huge effort to connect with the American people who'd rapidly lost trust in their government. Roosevelt traveled 20,800 kilometers by train all around America. He made 60 small speeches and 16 big speeches to people and was trying to reconnect, remind them that the government could be trusted. Roosevelt also promised to spend money to help the people. That was one of his key policies. He believed in an active government, a government that would help the people. And so he won the election in 1932 by a landslide 7 million votes. Clearly, laissez-faire policy and Republican policies had helped America boom in the 1920s, but actually it's the policies of the Democrats that will partially rescue the American people during the 1930s, and we'll go on to have a look at those policies in my next video. So that brings us to the end of our video on what was the experience of the American people during the Great Depression. We've looked at the impact of the Wall Street crash, the trigger point of the Great Depression, and we've looked at the impact on the American working people through rising unemployment, the farmers through the crisis, and then through business owners through business and bankruptcy. We've also looked at Hoover's attempted response and then Roosevelt's win in the 1932 election. Thanks for listening.